This is Teaching for Student Success. I'm Stephen Robineau. For decades, the United States has been trying to increase the number of students from underrepresented groups in STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, with limited success. There are a number of issues to deal with, beginning with general interest in the first place, which needs to translate into increased number of majors coming into the higher education system. And then once in, there are the issues of retention and persistence to an undergraduate degree, and finally, advancement to graduate degrees. In this episode, we will focus on a fascinating long-term study of female engineering students. But if you aren't an engineer, please don't leave. There is something for everyone here. The simplicity and success of the intervention we will discuss is surprising. We will talk with Dr. Nilanjana Dasgupta, Provost Professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences and the inaugural Director of the Institute for Diversity Sciences, an entity that invests in multidisciplinary STEM research for social justice. Dr. Dasgupta's Buju's research focuses on social groups, implicit bias, and how implicit biases influence self-perceptions, performance, and academic and career choices. In this episode, we will talk about Buju's November 2022 publication in Nature Communications. Female peer mentors early in college have lasting, positive impacts on female engineering students that persist beyond graduation. This is an amazing study following 150 students through their entire academic career and 1 year beyond. This fieldwork is translational in that it brings theory into practice. I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Dasgupta. Welcome, Buju. Thank you for joining us on Teaching for Student Success.
Thanks, Steve. It's really great to be here.
I'm so excited. Before we get into your study, perhaps you could describe the problem.
Yes, definitely. First, the problem. The problem space is that while we think that young people who start college are free to pursue whatever fields and questions and careers that they're interested in, the reality is that there are a lot of barriers that make students who are talented, interested in a variety of different disciplines and careers, end up switching out into other fields, dropping out of college altogether. So the problem that I'm interested in is how do we attract, retain, and nurture the success of all students? And my particular interest is especially students who are underrepresented in a field, and I use STEM as just a case in point. And in this particular study, I'm interested in how do we create an environment that allows female students to thrive in a field where there are very few students like them. In this case, engineering. But it could easily have been in math or physics or chemistry or computer science and so on.
Right. Thank you. Now, most research in this field would have a hypothesis and come up with an intervention, and they would test the impact 6 months or maybe a year later. Write it up and be done with it and move on. That's what's typical, I would say. If I understand correctly, this research took over 7 or 8 years to complete. It must have been multiple cohorts over time. Is that right?
That's correct. There are, only 15 or 20% of students entering engineering are women. That's true at our university. It's true nationwide. So in order to get those 150 women, we had to essentially get 4 cohorts of women students who are coming in with an interest in engineering and then pursue them for their entire 4+ years until graduation and beyond.
Right. So from the first cohort you started, with the last, when the last cohort got 5 years out, it may be even more than 8 years.
Yes, I think it was more like 9 years, right?
Wow. So that's a real tour de force, quite an accomplishment. You were quite a patient scientist.
Well, can I just say that my original intention was to follow these students for 1 year and to stop the study when they entered their sophomore year, their second year. But then somebody actually asked, are you going to follow them through to graduation, which had not originally occurred to me. And the grant, the National Science Foundation grant that supported it, would have ended. And I thought, this is such a precious sample that I needed to do everything I could to keep following them as long as I could make the funding work. So even after the grant ended, we just kept following the students, even though that wasn't the original intention.
Oh, interesting. Okay, well, let's get into it then. Can you describe the hypothesis you were testing and how you conducted this study?
We had two primary hypotheses. One is, does the experience of coming into college and having a mentor who is only 2 or 3 years senior to you, does that relationship, especially during the transition period into college, which can be very anxiety provoking and raise a lot of uncertainty and self-doubt in students, does having a peer mentor protect or inoculate against those anxieties and worries and help students transition through that first year? So that's question one. Question two is, does the sex of that peer mentor matter? Does any good peer mentor, regardless of whether they're male or female, would that work as well? Or for female students who are 15 or 20% of the students entering in engineering, would it be particularly beneficial to have a same-sex peer mentor? So that was question two. So is there a particular benefit or a particular boost or vaccination, if you will, to having a same-sex peer mentor? The third question, I would say, is how long does the effect last? So our mentoring was only in that first year of college, and then the mentors graduated. We actually thought that there's a good chance that the impact of the mentoring would fade over time. There would be a decay effect, that it would go through that first year, it would maybe last that second year, and then we would see a decay. And we actually didn't know if it would last, and if so, how long. So I think that would be the third question. And maybe the fourth question is, we had all kinds of different metrics. We had psychological metrics like confidence and motivation and emotional well-being. And then we had very objective metrics like actual internship experiences and actually what is the major that these students had at graduation. So we wanted to see, would this intervention have impacts both on the subjective feelings as well as the objective outcomes, or would one be more impactful than the other? These were sort of the host of research questions that we had.
Very cool. So if I understand correctly, I'll sort of summarize, I think, what you did. So you recruited 150 female engineering students. You gave them some story about what you were studying, which was not mentorship. You tell them something else. You say, hey, we're doing this study because we want to learn about X, but what you really want to know about is about mentorship, is about the mentorship experience.
That's right.
You ask them to fill out a survey or a questionnaire, I think, prior to starting.
That's right.
In the middle of the first year, at the end of the first year, and then once a year, every year thereafter, year to year, year 3, year 4, and year 5.
That's right.
And of these students, these 150 students, all female, you broke them roughly into 3 groups. One group had no mentor, one group had male mentors, and one group had female mentors. All right, so that's the paradigm of how you set this whole thing up. All right, so you've got these 150 students that you're following for their entire trajectory, it's really phenomenal. But before we talk about the results, can you talk about the diversity of the female students, the mentees in this case?
Yes. So about 20% of the students were first-generation college students. So they were the first in their family to go to a 4-year university. A similar percentage were students of color of various sorts. So some Black and African American students, some Latina students, Hispanic students, some Asian American students, and the remaining were white women. Most of what we know is in terms of their social class and their race and their sex, of course. We also know that a small percentage of students, I would say about 20-ish% also, had a member of their family, either a sibling or a parent or a close relative, who was in either engineering or in some other technical field, because we wanted to see if the intervention would be particularly impactful on some students versus another. Now, each of these three demographic variables that I'm talking about, race, ethnicity, social class, and their own family background in engineering or STEM in general, the numbers were small enough that we could not actually look to see if the impact on those students would differ as a function of having a peer mentor or a same-sex peer mentor, how that compared to students from the other demographic groups. So that sample was too small to look at it. But that was in general the diversity of the sample of women we had in the study.
Right. Great. Thank you. Okay, let's get to the data.
Yeah.
What did you observe over time, and what were your major results?
Actually, before we go to the results, I want to say that you emphasized that when we recruited these students, we didn't tell them what the study was about. And that from an experimental point of view is really important, because often mentoring experiences and mentoring studies are done where people are opting in. They're opting in to experience mentoring, and sometimes they're choosing their own mentor. Both the act of opting in and choosing a mentor makes it difficult to have any sort of causal explanation for why the mentoring works, if it does at all. So for us, it was really important to tell them very little about the study, say nothing about mentoring, say nothing about sex or gender, and to simply tell them that we are interested in your experiences in engineering majors, what helps, what doesn't help, and get some data on it so that we can, in the future, develop interventions. That's sort of what we told them. And we also said in passing that some of you may have a buddy in engineering or you may not. And we sort of said that in passing. So when students were opting into the study, they had no idea that the study had anything to do with mentoring. They also didn't know that we were only recruiting women students. And they also didn't know that when they finally did get the mentors, neither the mentors nor the mentees knew that the gender of the mentor and the mentee was an important variable, was the important variable in our study. We didn't make any mention of it. Again, so that any observed effects that we got was simply due to that relationship, not because of people's a priori assumptions about what they would experience. From an experimental point of view, that's important.
Right, I agree. Thank you for pointing that out. Also, although I don't know that it explicitly says it in the paper, I don't think there was any effort to match up female mentors with mentees in terms of race or social class or other criteria. The matching was just random.
Yeah. So mentees, our participants who were the mentees, were randomly assigned to one of three groups, either a female peer mentor or a male peer mentor or no mentor, without regard to any other demographic variable. And so the assignment was random.
Great. Thank you. One last thing.
Okay.
The mentorship was only in year one. It was only in the first year. And the average number of times that the mentor and mentee met was 4. They met 4 times. It doesn't sound like the meeting was particularly prescribed.
Yes. I think this is a really important point. Thank you for reminding me to emphasize this. So we had originally told the mentors that they should try and meet with their mentees once a month, which would have been at least 6 or 8 times during that first academic year. But in reality, we found that the median number of times mentor-mentees met were 4. typically twice in the fall and twice in the spring. And that seemed to be enough. The only thing we prescribed is that they should meet with their mentees one-on-one. They might do something else in addition, but at least meet with them one-on-one. What we found is that the real benefit of that mentoring experience on the mentees was only in the sex-matched condition. It is only when the female students had a female peer mentor that relationship was a protective factor. And I think of it as a social vaccine that protected them and their experiences against negative stereotypes, compared to both the no mentor condition as well as the male mentor condition. So having a male mentor was no different than being in the control condition. And that was a bit of a surprise. I actually had thought that there would be a benefit to having a mentor, regardless of sex, and there would be an added benefit to having a female peer mentor. What we found is that the benefit was all about the female peer mentors versus anything else. So those women who had a female peer mentor, their confidence in engineering was no different from the other groups at baseline before the mentor assignment. But that confidence in engineering held steady across their 4 years in college and post-graduation. Whereas the women in the other two groups who had male peer mentors or no mentors, their confidence in their own engineering ability declined steadily across that time. I think the important thing is at baseline, when these women came into our study, across the 150, there were no differences between people who were in one group or another group in terms of their confidence. But as a function of having that female peer mentor, the women with the female peer mentors held on to their confidence, and the women in the other two groups dropped in their confidence in engineering over time. And that drop continued from that first year in college through graduation.
Yeah, that's figure 1 in your paper, and I love it. It's an amazing graph. One line goes horizontal. The other two lines just drop over time.
And so similar to confidence, we found similar effects when we looked at students' motivation in engineering. Those who had female peer mentors, their motivation to stay in engineering, to continue to approach engineering, held steady across those 5 years. And those with male mentors or no mentors, their motivation dropped significantly across that period of time. We found similar effects when we looked at emotional health. And that was actually similar and in some ways a little bit sort of importantly different. The women who had female peer mentors, their emotional well-being increased over time. Whereas those in the other two conditions, they got more sort of emotionally stressed out and more burnt out over their time in college. So these were sort of our three big psychological benefits of having a female peer mentor that endured through graduation and then 1 year out. On the objective indicators, we found that students who had female peer mentors, they were much more likely to successfully secure engineering internships all through their college experience. And in engineering, like in many technical fields, that internship experience, having that, is really super important for post-graduation career success. So employers, especially if students go directly to the workplace, are much more likely to hire someone who's had internship experience than someone who hasn't. So the women who had female peer mentors were much more likely to be successful in securing and completing engineering internships than the women in the other two conditions. And finally, in terms of their actual major at graduation, which is important because we know that students in STEM in general and engineering in particular often switch out of these majors within the first 3 semesters. So we were really interested in what their major would be, not just when they came into college or just at the end of their first year, but at the point of graduation. And we found that women who had female peer mentors were significantly more likely to graduate with STEM majors than women in the other two conditions. And those who switched from engineering to another major were still switching to computer science, to mathematics, to physics, but they essentially stayed in the STEM sphere compared to the women in the other two groups with male peer mentors or no mentors who were significantly more likely to switch out. So those were sort of the main findings of our paper, which showed that one, that having a same-sex peer mentor had endurable effects both while that relationship was active and then 4 years out, long after that relationship had ended and the person had graduated, the mentor had graduated. Two, that the benefits were evident both on psychological outcomes as well as objective outcomes. And three, that the effect was really specific to a same-sex peer mentor and not general to any good peer mentor. One thing I didn't say that I want to make clear is that sometimes people will wonder, looking at these findings, that is it that the female peer mentors were just better at mentoring? That really the effect is the quality of mentoring rather than the sex match of the mentor-mentees. And we thought about that. And so we actually, during that first year when the mentoring was active, we asked the mentees to privately report to us how supportive their mentors were, how much their mentors were available to them, how close they felt to the mentor, how much they admired their mentor, and how similar they felt to the mentor. On all dimensions of support, availability, admiration, we found that the mentees had equally positive, favorable feelings about the quality of the mentorship, regardless of whether their mentor was male or female. The only dimension where we found a small difference was how close they felt to the mentors. Not surprisingly, female mentees felt somewhat closer to the female peer mentors than the male peer mentors. Perceived closeness didn't statistically explain our effect. So essentially, the quality of the mentoring was equally good in both conditions, but its impact on those mentees was substantially different, substantially more effective for the same-sex mentors.
That's interesting. It makes me wonder about the social maturity. I'm not sure what the right term is here of women versus men, just generally.
Well, so let me just make sure that we're on the same page. Actually, the female and male peer mentors were equally good. There was no difference in, if by maturity you mean, was there a difference in the quality of the mentoring the mentors provided? The answer is no, there wasn't. We also had the mentors keep a diary where they told us what they talked about. Did they talk about career stuff, academic stuff, or socio-emotional support? We found, again, this was somewhat surprising. We found that most of the mentors, regardless of the mentor's sex, talked about career and academic stuff, less socio-emotional stuff. And what they talked about did not differ by the sex of the mentor. So again, we just don't have any evidence so far about, was there any difference in what they talked about? As far as we could tell, there wasn't. Was there a difference in the quality of the mentoring? As far as we measured, there wasn't. Was there a difference in the outcome? Yes, there was.
So I guess what I was trying to verbalize was it was a notion of social emotional connection.
Yeah, and we actually thought that it might be that female mentor and mentees would talk more about socio-emotional things. The quality of the data, the online diary data that the mentors provided wasn't very high quality. They didn't write a lot. So I actually don't feel super confident in the diary data. So I think that if we could do a follow-up or do it again, I would have better measures of what they actually discussed. What we have is superficial. So it is possible that there is something in some difference in what they talked about or how they talked that we just weren't able to capture. But what we can say is that the number of times they met and how the mentees felt about their mentors did not differ across conditions.
It's amazing. That they didn't write much is not surprising. These are engineering majors, right?
That's right.
They're not not English majors or creative writing majors.
That's right. That's right.
So let me take this a little different direction. So I've been thinking about this study, and you're studying a group of female students while they're in the great minority in their program. These students are themselves already exceptional because these are women going into engineering. These students must have been confident and motivated before they came to the university, right? Just to enter a program that they know is extremely rigorous and they know is male-dominated. And so now I'm going to ask questions that I don't think you have data for, but I guess I'm just going to ask these questions. Do female students leave engineering or STEM at higher rates than male colleagues? And do they go to graduate school at the same rate as male colleagues?
That's a really good question. So at the national level, the data that I've seen is that overall, the rate of switching out from engineering is very high. It's about 40% is my memory of it. But I actually didn't see any difference at the national level in whether the rate of switching out of engineering between men and women. The rates were similar. It was just that everybody had a higher rate of switching out. But because the numbers of women in engineering is much smaller, even though the proportion of switching out may be the same, it results in a significantly smaller number. But as far as I know, the rate of switching out is similar for women and men at the national level.
So that's interesting. Let's just assume, without intervention, male and female engineering students leave engineering at the same rate. They go to internships at the same rate. They lose confidence at the same rate.
Can I stop you there? So I think that women lose confidence in their engineering ability at a higher rate than men do. That is part of the problem. So what is the same is the attrition out of engineering, again, at the national level, in terms of proportions, is roughly the same. But how confident do students feel about their ability? There is a very clear gender difference, where women feel significantly less confident about their ability in STEM in general, and certainly in engineering relative to men. And that is part of the problem that we were trying to solve. So even though the behavior of switching out might be the same, how I feel, whether I'm good enough, that's where you find that it's the imposter syndrome. That's where the difference, the big gender differences are. And that's part of what we were trying to solve. That's why we measured confidence and motivation and well-being and not simply what is their major in internship. That psychological variables in some way are the early harbingers of whether somebody is going to persist or not, right? If you think you're not good enough, you may not drop out tomorrow, but that dropping out might happen a few semesters out. So confidence, I think, is a very good early marker of interest, persistence. Is this worth it? Is this worth my while to be in this field? You asked another question, which I wanted to address, which is there a difference in the proportion of women compared to men who go on to graduate school, graduate pathways in engineering? And that there is. The numbers of women compared to men at the undergraduate level, the gender difference is smaller. That gender difference becomes bigger when it comes to entry into master's programs and then entry into PhD programs and graduation from PhD programs and then entry into fields, into careers in engineering. So at every step, as the person is getting more advanced, the gender divide grows bigger.
Okay, so then this work of supporting women to help them maintain their confidence, maintain their motivation, maintains their interest in postgraduate education.
That's correct. So, one of the ways I think about this is that in the pathway that people go through from post-secondary education through graduation to whatever the next chapter is, at every part where people make the jump from the end of one chapter to the next chapter of their life, it is in those transition periods that the attrition is the biggest. And so that is why our intervention was in that first jump from high school to college. And that is also why we followed these women for their second jump from graduation to where they went next, because it is in those periods that we see attrition the most.
Thanks. Right. All right. So the initial hypothesis that you had was that the relationship of female peer mentors in the first year of college would help them, and I quote, disregard negative stereotypes, preserve their motivation in engineering courses, and increase persistence and professional development in STEM. And importantly, you predicted that these benefits would endure through 1 year post-graduation, 3 to 5 years after the conclusion of the mentorship intervention. That's what you proposed, and this hypothesis was based on, and you've mentioned this now, the stereotype inoculation model. Could you take a moment to describe the stereotype inoculation model?
So the stereotype inoculation model is sort of a framework that I developed back in 2011, where I proposed that, and I'll use a biomedical metaphor to explain it because it seems so appropriate in these days, that just as a biomedical vaccine protects and inoculates our physical body against noxious bacteria and viruses, so too, exposure to a same-sex person who is successful in a field protects and inoculates our mind against noxious stereotypes that cast doubt on our group's ability to be successful in a field. So for these women students in engineering, meeting a successful senior student who is also a woman inoculates them, protects them against the stereotype that maybe women can't make it in this field. And that's what we found. It is that same-sex mentor who is successful that inoculated these women's sense of what they are capable of against these stereotypes.
All right. So the idea is that it really helps them see themselves being successful because other people like them are successful.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think it's worth saying that sometimes the effect of seeing other people like you, it is somewhat implicit. It isn't necessarily articulated by the mentee to herself. So remember that when we asked the mentees, how much do you feel similar to your mentor? Or how close do you feel? How much do you admire them? What they said about their male mentors was as favorable as what they said about their female mentors. So the impact of the female mentors on what the students felt that they could do, in some ways was sort of unarticulated, was unspoken, and I think partly implicit.
It's interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with this program. I've talked about it a couple of times now. Jeff Shinsky at the Foothill Community College. You're shaking your head, so you may be familiar with the Scientists Spotlight program.
Yes.
Which is a very different idea. Well, maybe it's a similar idea, but it's a very different, very direct approach to show students people that look like them being successful in the field.
Yes. So I think this actually raises this interesting point that I want to mention, even though we don't actually directly have data on it, which is that why does seeing someone like you have this positive effect on what you think is possible for yourself? One is simply that your sense of the future self, what is possible for you in the future, seeing somebody concrete allows you to see the pathway, the steps you need to take, the stepping stones to get there. So the stepping stones become more visible to the individual than in the absence of that person. And that may be particularly true if you have sort of rich data about them. But, or I should say, and it is also possible that the benefit can happen in a different mechanism, which I think is independent of the inspiration effect, which is that having a same-sex mentor, that person opens doors for you to other people and expands the mentee's social network, especially their professional network in their academic field, right? So I actually think what may be happening, which we didn't measure, now I'm kicking myself that we didn't measure it, that I think that the mentors introduce their mentee to a bunch of other people. And now the mentees in their first year of college knew a bunch of other people who they related to, probably a lot of women, but not exclusively women. And so I think that the mentors are enriching and expanding their mentees' educational, professional, and social network in a way that grounds them in their college experience, so that now when the mentor is graduated and gone, the mentee now has a firm footing in where they are. Whereas probably the male mentors may not have done the same sort of introductions, or perhaps the introductions they made didn't take root as much. So another way of saying it is, I think that the benefit of the mentoring experience may have happened through expanded social networks for the same-sex pairs than the different sex pairs. So I actually think that is likely to be one pathway why this mentoring was so effective and why it lasted beyond the mentor's graduation. And I think it's independent of a pure inspiration effect, where you see someone like you and you sort of can see how you can go from here to the next step to the next step. I think both are likely to be happening. And I think I went into the study thinking more about the inspiration effect, because that's sort of more grounded in my past research, much more like Jeff's research. But in the course of thinking more about it and reading more about the social network research, began to think that I think the second pathway is probably equally valid.
So interesting that you went in that direction, because in your paper, you speculate on two additional theory-driven mechanisms. One of them is about women sharing social networks with their peers as a way to share their identity. I was going to ask about that. You've answered that in anticipation. Let's go to the second mechanism that you mention in the paper, mindset. You propose that mindset may play a role in this as well. Would you like to elaborate?
Yes. So the way mindset might play a role is that in that mentoring experience, one thing we did tell the mentors to talk about with their mentees when it was appropriate is to tell their mentees about their own struggles and setbacks when they were first and second year students. And the goal of that was to normalize difficulties and failures or struggles in general of all kinds, academic, personal, transition to college, and so on. The reason we said that is to sort of tap into the growth mindset literature, which shows very nicely that when students understand that learning and success is not just a one and done thing, that you just perform and you either are successful or you're not, but that learning and success happens through multiple experiences of struggle, setbacks, some success, struggle, setbacks, some success. And it's this iterative process, that knowing that would allow them to put their own struggles into context. So we think that that is likely to have happened. And that's much more at the level of the individual mindset. So how the mentees perceived their own struggles and successes in the context of what they were hearing from their mentors. And the second one, the social network point of view or explanation, is that it's not just what's happening in the mind of the mentee. It is also how their relationships are growing over time.
There's a lot more work to continue to do here. There's a lot of questions to poke at here.
Yes, there are a lot of questions to poke at. And I personally have become a big fan of the relationships explanation. I think that some relationships, it's not the number, it's the quality of the relationships. Well, I take that back. I think it may be a combination of the quantity and quality. There's some social network research that shows that weak ties can sometimes be very impactful for people to get jobs. So it's not just strong ties, but I think those ties or the relationships, the people you know, needs to be combined with the sort of research that I do or that I've done in the past and I do, which is about how does the experience affect the individual's psychology and the individual's behavior. But I think those individual experiences are really embedded in the context. And I think the kind of context that I'm more and more interested in is how do the relationships people form through that early educational experience and even in the workplace. Which kind of relationships open doors to opportunity? And when do those relationships, when in that human development phase, when are those relationships especially vital? both which kinds and when do they matter the most.
Okay, so this reminds me of episode 5, I think, when I spoke with Harriet Schwartz. I don't know if you know Harriet Schwartz. She's written a book called Connected Teaching, which is about relational cultural theory and its application to education. The book is called Connected Teaching. It's fascinating. She's wonderful, and I'm sure she'd be super interested in these questions. The questions we talked about were about faculty-student relationships, but as you're pointing out, you're talking about the importance of student-to-student relationships in this peer-mentor situation. Yeah, my head is just sort of exploding with all these ideas. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I love this idea of connected teaching. And so I think this sort of raises another unanswered question that is worth sort of amplifying, that there are benefits of these relationships in academic environments, some from faculty and people who are ahead of you, who are sort of who are experts, and others from people who are peers. And when I think about stereotype inoculation model, I actually think about, and I've written about both what is the inoculation a young person gets from somebody who's an expert, as compared to what is the inoculation they receive from somebody who is a peer. And I think in some ways they might be different. And so my sort of working hypothesis is that the peer mentor, the near peer mentor, lights the pathway from where the student is to just a few steps ahead of them. And that's actually really important because the expert is way ahead of them. And that may not be helpful to the student to understand how they would get there. But a near peer shows you just enough about what you need to do, the next 2 or 3 steps you need to take. And I think that is maybe more potent in the transition to college, where the experience of somebody who has just gone through what you have may be more powerful than the experience of a professor who is 50 years old and who is 32 years older than you. So I think that's one thing. So I think the socio-emotional support, this is another way of saying it, the socio-emotional support that comes from a peer may actually be more powerful than something that comes from an expert. But there may be other things that an expert, a faculty member provides that is about things that are more about the domain, the content area, about how to do something and how to do it well, and the feedback and to get better at it, the skill development. So I think the skill development part may be more the kind of stuff that a young person entering college will get from a faculty or a graduate teaching assistant. But the socio-emotional, am I good enough? Can I do it? What happens when I fail? I think that stuff, they're much more likely to benefit from a peer mentor. This is purely speculative, I should say, right? I've never compared one compared to the other in a sort of a head-to-head competition experimentally.
This makes me think about, I'm going to use the wrong terms here, this notion of when you're trying to learn something, learn stuff, learn content, and faculty give students problems to work on. You don't want to give them a problem that is massively too hard. You don't want to give them the hardest problem on the planet. You want to give them a problem that stretches them, that makes them work, that they might fail at first, but that they can eventually succeed, that they can succeed if they work hard enough. So the term I want to use is zone of proximal development or zone of proximal learning. That's the wrong term, but there is some term out there about learning.
Yes, there is. And I actually can't remember the name of the theory, but you're absolutely right. There's more than one theory about this zone of proximal development. It's a little bit Piagetian that learning happens even in early childhood when what is being learned is a little bit beyond what the child knows. So I think there are multiple theories that bear on this issue of learning is most effective if it's just a little bit beyond, if it stretches the person beyond where they are, but not too far out.
And that's what I'm being reminded of when you talk about what peers provide, this notion of stepping stones, and that a student can see the next one like, oh, that's going to be hard, but it's right there. And once you leap to one stone And it's like, oh, look what I did. And then the confidence that you can make the next leap or the next step. Yeah, that's the visions that are popping in my head as you've talked about that. It's really interesting.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think some of it is psychological, as you're saying it, the sort of the way you're speaking about it, that if they can do it, I can do it. And some of it is, I think, much more pragmatic, which is that the peer mentor can say, oh, try that internship. Let me introduce you to the hiring manager there. Or let's go to the career development fair and talk to that, go to that table. Or this is a TA who helped me, who I found helpful. Or take the class with so and so, not so and so. So there's a lot of actually pragmatic stuff that faculty may not know, that students who've gone through this a year ago, 2 years ago, have much better advice to give their mentees. So there is both the inspirational, the psychological benefit of seeing the stepping stones light up, and there is the pragmatics of where do the stepping stones sit and how can I not slip over them, and which stepping stones are better than which others, that I think are both relevant here.
Very interesting. So how generalizable do you think these findings are for other underrepresented and negatively stereotyped groups?
Right. So there is some research on mentoring same race mentors with Black students. And also there's other research on Black teachers' inspiring effect on Black students. So I think there's reason, a lot of this research that I'm thinking of is not experimental. So the cause and effect isn't always clear, but that research is consistent with ours, showing that when a student is underrepresented, and especially when a student is underrepresented in a field where there are negative stereotypes about their group, that having a same race mentor or same race faculty member is very beneficial. I think we still need to do the work of testing generalizability using experiments to see whether the effect is where it converges and generalizes and where it might be different. The other version of your question, which I haven't said anything about, has to do with the fact that students' identities are intersectional. So the question is if is a match between mentor-mentees equally effective if it is on gender, but not on race? Or does it have to be on gender and race? What about sexual orientation? What about social class? And we could sort of spin out into lots of different types of identities and what would matter more and what level of specificity of matching is important. And I think we don't know the answers to those questions. If I had to guess, I would say that the identity that is the most salient to the student, to the person, what matters to them, in terms of like what type of social identity matters to them most, is the dimension of matching that is probably most likely to be effective for that student. This identity, whether it's on how much does my gender matter to my sense of self, how much does my race or ethnicity matter to me, or my sexual orientation, or the fact that I'm a working class student, all of that is hugely individual. There's a lot of individual differences. So I think that it might be good actually to do some research where we measure what kind of identities matter to individual students, and we randomly assign them to a mentor. I'm making this up as I'm going, a peer mentor who is from a group that matters to them, whatever that group is, or we randomly assign them to a mentor who matches with them on a different identity that is less salient to them, that's less sort of central to their sense of self, or to somebody who's different from them in terms of social identity. So you have a matched identity that is important to the sense of self, a matched identity that's not so important to that person, and then a mismatched identity. And then redo the study and see what happens.
Okay. So you mentioned in the paper, and I love this idea, the challenge that we both know you're going to have is in the N, the number is going to have to be, 150 isn't enough. It's going to have to be 1,500. You're going to have tenfold the number of people to get the power to get these small numbers big enough so that you have enough statistical power to pull information out.
Yeah.
Because even in your data, there are some minor issues that you can't quite say. And you can't say, well, it's okay. We had 150. We'll double it. We'll go to 300. And it's got to be something much higher than that. I'm just going to pull out tenfold to really increase the power significantly.
So there's two ways I can interpret your question. One is about statistical power. So what kind of sample size do I need to ensure that my effects are robust and generalizable to women in engineering in general? So that's a statistical question. The other version of the question is a feasibility question, which is about if we want, or a scalability question. If you wanted to scale these findings and put them into effect in a program, what would be a good way to scale this impact? Those are two very different questions.
Yeah, I meant to do a study on whether a student's most important social identity versus a different identity that they have during that study becomes, I would think, also a problem of power, that you have enough people of different identities to be able to pull that together. So that seems like you need a lot of, I don't know what the number is, it's a statistical problem.
Yes.
I think the issue of how do you implement what you've done across the nation is trivial. What we haven't talked about is the money. You recruited students to be mentors. You paid them $100 for the year. So if you've got an engineering program with an incoming class of, let's take a big one, 500 students. Let's say we have 500 students coming in and 20% of them are women. Well, that's 100 women. Each mentor is paid $100. So you need $10,000 to run this program for a year that is going to have a 5-year impact.
That's right.
On the student's trajectory.
That's right.
If I went to the deans I worked for, any of the deans I work for, any of the deans I know, that is easy money, right? If you're going to get women to persist through engineering and it's going to cost you $10,000, you should be able to get this throughout the country. People will be slapping themselves in the head.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would go bigger and say that anybody who's listening or any potential funder who is interested in scaling this intervention could essentially fund a few big state university systems to run this program, to pay $10,000 per cohort to run this program at multiple universities for multiple cohorts and to look at the impacts for across the nation. Yes, as you said, that the amount of money the mentors got was a small honorarium. It was nothing. And the mentees got paid to do the surveys. They got, I think, $20 to do the survey and then $25 the second time and $30 the third time.
Yeah. There were some annual costs with that. I forgot about that. Mm-hmm.
I think the main thing is actually what you need is a person, the people power, to be the administrative glue. What you need to do is occasionally nudge people and say, hey, did you meet with your mentee? Or, hey, mentee, your mentor's trying to get in touch with you. Text them back. And to essentially ensure that when students get really busy in their academic year and overwhelmed, that the mentor-mentees are still meeting up. And so those periodic check-ins, I think, are actually really the important thing. It's not so much the money.
It's not the money.
And so the periodic check-ins by a person, a staff person, a program manager, who is essentially holding the pieces together is really the important thing. So I think it would be really high impact and low cost to run this program across multiple universities across the nation and pay a staff person, a program manager, and pay a small honorarium to the mentors and to measure. I think as a researcher, for me, even if it is a program and not an experiment, measuring the impacts of what it's having is really important instead of assuming that it must be good because it worked one time.
I'm actually pretty excited about this. I'm going to talk to some people. We're going to be back in touch about this question. So I want to end our conversation with two questions. One, a Teaching for Student Success listener, Dr. Marvin O'Neill at the State University of New York in Stony Brook, suggested this question related to student success. If you could wave your magic wand and have every faculty member do one thing, what would it be?
To benefit student success.
To benefit student success, yeah.
Okay. I have something for you. It's something that I actually was talking with undergraduate student in my class just yesterday who was taking a makeup exam. I'm going to give you the concrete example and maybe then I'll go broader. What she told me is that the first day of class, I started this new thing that I do. I give students these blank index cards and I say, write your name, something you're interested in, a hobby, something you enjoy, and write something if there's anything that might be a barrier that's going on in your life, that may be a barrier to your learning, that might crop up in the semester, that I should know about. Tell me what it is. And that opened the door, according to that student, and I've seen this in my undergraduate and my graduate students, for some students who are going through some stuff that I would have no idea about, writing something that opened a conversation with them, that now I know that something is going on or something might happen later in the semester. And that opens a communication channel and the beginnings of a relationship, so that if something were to happen later on and they're absent, or they don't hand in their work, or the student is doing poorly, I know what's going on. And then the student and I are much more likely to talk, and I can be more flexible about their learning and so on. And that has made a huge difference, much more than I would have ever anticipated. It's made a huge difference to the student, because now they know that I care and they can be vulnerable and say something. And I've explicitly given them permission to in some private way. It's not always sort of spoken. It's something that they write. I think that's made a huge difference. And I have seen, again, both for undergraduates and graduate students, in both of these cases I'm thinking of, when something later happens down the semester, when the semester gets really stressful, these students are much more likely to reach out to me than disappear. So another way of saying this is that the magic wand for me that I've realized is that opening the door to forming a relationship with my students and welcoming that in a way that is a light touch, not too much, but actually written, has made an enormous difference in the lives of students who otherwise may not have made it in my class through the semester.
Interesting. And how long have you been doing that for?
Not very long. I'm actually embarrassed to say that I didn't figure this out earlier. I think a colleague of mine suggested this a few years ago, and I don't know exactly when I started it, but I don't think it was more than 4 years ago. I think it was pre-COVID, because I remember it was when we still did physical cards.
Wonderful. I love it. Marvin is going to love it. Marvin is going to start doing this. He has classes of about 1,200 students a semester, but I think he'll do it.
Yes. And I'll tell you that the student of mine who yesterday told me how much of a difference it made to her said to me that in my organic chemistry class, which is a lot bigger, my class only has 25 students. She said that if my professors had done that, most students wouldn't have anything to say, right? But there may be a small number of students who would say something. And it is those students who would benefit the most. So in some ways, I think it is as important in big classes as it is in small ones, and probably more important because in big classes, we usually would not even know what is going on with the student, except that they haven't shown up in class.
I used to teach big classes and students want to be seen.
Yeah.
I think that's great. I love that. I really like that a lot. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
I actually remembered I still don't remember who my colleague was who suggested this, but I remember the context in which it came up. It actually came up in the context of gender pronouns. It came up to say that if a student wants to tell us as faculty, as instructors, that they have a preferred pronoun that may not be evident to us as instructors who don't know them, the index card is a way they can let us know. So that's how it started. So I said, tell me your name, tell me your hobby. If you have preferred pronouns you want to tell me that. And then tell me if there's anything that I should know. But it is, interestingly, I added the anything that I should know part. That was not the original thing. But it is that question where I've learned the most about my students. And that has opened the door to relationships with them.
And again, connected teaching, relational cultural theory, Harriet Schwartz. I think we might have to have a group meeting. I would love to put that together. I want to be on the wall when the two of you talk. I want to be there. I think that'd be super interesting.
I definitely want to read her book. Yeah, it's very relevant to this last question you're asking me.
Okay, well, so let's get to the last question. So lastly, you've chosen to work on issues of implicit bias and stereotype threat that impact people's interactions with each other and impact how we see ourselves, which impacts then many of our own personal choices. It's not just interpersonal, it's intrapersonal, these issues. I want to know why you chose this. I want to know if there was a transformational moment that drove you into this discipline. Or just personally, why is this important to you?
There is actually a moment. I've been interested, my research has been on implicit bias and how to change implicit bias, or what, if anything, can change it, but about other people and other groups to which the individual, the perceiver, doesn't belong. But the effect of these implicit biases on the self, which is the area of research that I've been doing in the last 20 years, is actually influenced by a student in a class I taught when I was a postdoc at the University of Washington in Seattle, who was an engineering student, was taking my class, and I had no idea why an engineering student was taking a psychology class, an advanced seminar. So I asked her after class, and I got to know her better, and I learned that she was switching out of engineering. She had been doing well, but over time, she started seeing that there were fewer women in her class, engineering classes. And there was one day she said she realized she was the only woman in this large class. And she felt that the instructor was looking at her. It's unclear whether he actually was, but that's how she felt awkward. And then she began to slowly doubt whether she was doing well enough. And then she began to wonder whether she was interested enough. And then she started, taking other classes. And then she finally switched. The fact that she was doing well in engineering, and she had been recruited into the University of Washington because she was in high school, was doing really well in math and science. And so she was a recruit into their engineering program. And that the final class, engineering class, this is something I recently found out from her after I reconnected with her. She picked up her exam with a friend of hers, and she had already decided she was switching out. And she got an A in the final exam, but she had already made up her mind to switch out. What that made me realize is that it wasn't ability or performance that was the reason why a bunch of these students leave a field. It was a combination of feeling a lack of belonging. And that lack of belonging bled into confidence. And that confidence bled into lost interest. And that bled into giving up. And then finally, it's just not worth it. And it was that student and the conversations I had with her. And then I recruited her to be my research assistant. By then, she was a psych major. And I got to know her more over the years, over that, I think, a year and a half or maybe 2 years. And that was the relationship. And that was the student that made me wonder that I should start looking at the effect of these implicit biases on people's own perceptions of their ability and interests, not just how they see other people, it's how they see themselves.
Right. How these biases impact oneself. Does she know the impact she's had on you? Have you had this conversation with her?
Yes, recently. Actually, in the last 6 months or so. I didn't know where she was. I Googled her. I found her. And I set up a Zoom conversation with her. And I told her how much our conversations had shifted the direction of my research. And she had no idea. And she told me how much our conversations had helped her understand why she felt the way she felt and given her language to understand these inchoate experiences that she just didn't have the language for. She ended up getting a PhD in psychology, and she pursued a different career. She's not an academic. I think has pursued a career where she is helping other students, perhaps like her former self. So yes, I have reconnected with her very recently.
Interesting. So can you give us a little more insight into what she's doing? Are you comfortable with that?
She's in higher education. She's in student development, student affairs. So she is in that space.
And you've gotten in touch with her in the last 6 months. Huh.
That's right.
And if it's okay, I'm going to say that when you worked with her was over 20 years ago.
Yes.
So
yes,
my timing is fortuitous. I happen to have caught you shortly after you had this conversation with her.
That's right. I think it took me, I should say that I didn't know. I'm reconstructing the story backwards. I didn't know when I started this research that those conversations that the student and I had nudged the direction of my research when I became an assistant professor. I don't think I fully understood that myself. There was a couple of steps in between that played a role. One was that I was doing some research on women in leadership and whether women saw themselves as having leadership abilities rather than being in a support role, being in a supportive role rather than being the person who was a visionary and who was the go-getter. I did this study with a former grad student of mine in comparing women in a women's college to in a co-ed college. And we found that women they came into college with similar implicit beliefs about gender and leadership, which is that they felt that men had more leadership abilities than women did implicitly, not explicitly. But that by the end of their first year in college into their second year, the women who were at the women's college had showed no gender stereotypes at all, whereas their peers at the co-ed college showed significantly more gender stereotypes associating men more with leadership than women. When we dug into it, what we found is that happened because the women at the women's college had more classes with women faculty. And the women at the co-ed college had fewer classes with women faculty. And really the strengthening of the gender stereotypes at the co-ed college happened among STEM students whose classes were mostly with other male faculty. It is that finding that I think in my mind got connected to these conversations with this woman student in engineering, where I thought, these women in classes taught mostly by men who now believe that leadership is sort of a men's thing, got connected in my mind with the student I had taught who left engineering and moved into psychology. And somehow I started thinking I should test this question in STEM, not in leadership, but in STEM, to see how to inoculate these stereotypes that these women had, that they might be applying to themselves, that might be the reason why they were leaving STEM fields or not pursuing STEM fields. And maybe if I could inoculate them with seeing more women in these roles, that would protect them and build confidence and help them thrive. So the story about my former student affecting me, I think, has crystallized in my mind only in recent years, which is why I reached out to her in the last 6 months. I don't think I realized that fully 10 years ago.
That's very cool. I love that.
Thank you.
That is a great story. She must have loved hearing from you. She must have loved that.
I think it was mutual. It made me realize how a chance encounters has these profound ripple effects in the lives of the teacher and the student. And this is why, back to the question you asked me, what is the one thing that the magic wand question you asked me? It's that relationship that matters the most, right? If I hadn't had conversations with these students saying, why are you an engineering student taking a psych class? I wouldn't have gone down this road, nor would she have understood why what happened to her happened, and nor would she have pursued a PhD in social psychology. It's all connected.
It's all connected. Yeah, that's great. That's great. I don't even know what to say after that. That's so fantastic. So I'm going to say thank you. And I think I prefer calling you Nilanjana.
Nilanjana, yes.
Nilanjana, yeah.
You do?
Yeah.
How come?
That's a good question. My PhD advisor was Kalpana. I don't know. I'm very fond of her. Mm-hmm. We have a wonderful relationship. And, the name Kalpana, Nilanjana, those names roll nicely. It's very sweet. Yeah. Just it rolls nicely. Yeah.
Yeah, Nilanjana.
Yeah. I don't know. Buju, it's cute. It's sweet. Do people call you that?
I think most people call me Buju, partly because if they know me, they know that's how I introduce. If they don't know me, they feel less self-conscious saying Buju, and they're more worried about tripping up and pronouncing Nilanjana, which I think is actually good for your audience to hear Nilanjana said right, because that makes a name that may be unfamiliar to many of your listeners become familiar. And I think it's really important that, to me, it's important that people start to see Nilanjana as familiar as Jane Doe. So I think hearing it matters.
Yes, I agree. Nilanjana, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. This has been a wonderful conversation. Your work is amazing. These stories that you told at the end were fantastic. We're going to have to talk more about getting all the engineering programs around the country to listen to this. Anyway, I just want to say thank you so much. This has really been great. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Steve. This was really, really fun. I think I loved our conversation. It was really mutual. And yes, I think if you find opportunities to scale up the benefits beyond these 150 across multiple universities, and if you find people who are interested in funding it and making it happen and collaborating on it, I would love to be part of that conversation.
Absolutely. I think that's possible. For more information about Dr. Dasgupta, her research and favorite books and papers, please go to our website, teachingforstudentsuccess.org. Thank you for spending time with us today. Please share our podcast and website with your friends, colleagues, and administrators. We love hearing from listeners. Please contact us through our website. If an episode has impacted your teaching, and I think today there's a lot of opportunities here, please send us a note and tell us your story. Teaching for Student Success is a production of Teaching for Student Success Media. Let's end this podcast with some music of Julius H. Some of Julius's music can be found on Pixabay.